Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Test Tubes and Cauldrons, a podcast where we talk about the science behind spirituality and attempt to merge the two as they were in ancient times. In this episode, we are going to be talking about being safe while doing magic. I intend to call this episode Don't Be an Idiot just because I think it's kind of funny and it fits in with the theme pretty well. But we're going to cover a wide range of topics from fire safety to working with herbs and being safe while doing that, essential oils, crystals, many different things. So if you're interested in that, please join us. But actually, before we get into that, let's do our What Happened on This Day segment. So we are recording this on March 20th, and on this day in 1916, Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity was published as an academic paper in a physics journal. This theory accounted for the slow rotation of the elliptical path of the planet Mercury, which Newtonian gravitational theory failed to do. I was actually just talking to somebody a little bit earlier in this week about the Einstein's theory of relativity, so I thought it was really interesting and kind of funny that it coincided. Okay, so let's go ahead and just head into our topic. Let's dive right in. This is going to be a long episode because I feel like we're going to rant a little bit in our respective areas.
Yeah.
Too often in the spiritual community, new practitioners begin to dabble with almost little to no regard of the safety issues that are found in nearly every single facet. So in this episode, we'll be talking about safety in the spiritual community, the many issues we see with it, and ways to practice safely based on common scientific safety guidelines that we should follow to ensure no life-threatening accidents happen. We don't want any test tubes breaking or the equivalent of that, magically speaking. The first thing that we wanted to talk about was fire safety. So does anybody want to start with that? Let's talk about maybe what a fire safety hazard is.
We need to think about fire as three things. We need fuel, heat, and oxygen. So if you have those three things, you have a fire, but you also have a risk. So when you're managing a fire, you always need to bear in mind that you can remove one of those three things and decrease the risk. So that means keeping your workspace not cluttered, so there's not too much fuel around for the fire to spread. That means having an appropriate plan to put stuff out when you need to. So that might be something to get rid of the oxygen, so covering it up perhaps, or using sand or using water, and making sure that you use the right type of fire management for the type of fire. Because if you put water on a grease fire, it's just going to go up. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I've definitely tried to put water on the wrong kind of fire, and it's got worse because of that. So I guess those are the main things to bear in mind from my perspective on fire safety.
Yeah, I think a big one for me with fire safety is to plan ahead and also have an emergency plan in place. So a lot of fire mishaps happen because people go to burn in the magical community, something popular is the bay leaf. But you start burning it and you don't have a fire safe container nearby to drop it into. So now you're holding this burning bay leaf, freaking out because it's going to burn you, or maybe the ashes are falling onto a wooden surface or onto your carpet, which is what I have. None of that is good. So not planning ahead and having a bowl that you can put it in that's fire safe and won't melt or anything is really, really important. But kind of along the same lines, it's really important to have a plan in place if something were to catch on fire and if the fire was to get out of control, and not only to have a plan, but also to practice it. Because you can have a plan, the perfect plan, right? But if you haven't practiced it and it's something that's totally foreign to you, when you actually go to do it the first time, you are going to be so not aware or in the moment because you're going to be so freaked out because of the fire. That's normal kind of panic mode mentality. But if you have a plan and you've practiced it before, then when a fire does get out of control, if it does, hopefully you never experience that. But if it does get out of control, you'll be able to kind of keep calm and remember, okay, these are the steps that I need to take in order to put the fire out, removing some kind of fuel, or to get yourself out of the situation and make sure that you leave safely. So those are the two things that I really want to iterate. Make sure you have the appropriate things nearby to stop something or to make sure that you're practicing fire safety, and then also have a plan and have practiced your plan. Preferably more than once. In fact, the more times you do it, the better. Think of it like the magical equivalent of practicing the stop, drop, and roll. Anybody have any fire stories?
Gosh. I mean, I guess my main thing, so when I use a lot of fire in my practice, I have a little cauldron. I once, last year, me and my housemates broke up my cauldron and roasted marshmallows over it, which is quite exciting. It was also kind of sad, though, because we're sitting there on the porch hovering over this tiny little thing. So I have these very tall, they're kind of like Greek-style pillars on my altar, and they're candle holders. And whenever I'm burning candles on them, I often will put a little bowl of water near them just in case it falls it'll fall into the bowl of water. One time, this was a very stupid thing for me to do. One time I had a little cup candle that I'd made. I made it in a little teacup, and I had it on fire, and I had some dried herbs in there for some reason. Started getting a little crazy. And I decided to sprinkle water on it, but I didn't sprinkle it enough. And so then the water was like, and I was like,
Oh, no.
I'm so lucky, honestly. Like, I could feel the heat. I'm very lucky I did not burn down my house. Don't do that. And another thing that I see a lot of people do that I'm always careful of is essential oils. Don't put essential oils on candles. I've heard of people putting Florida water on candles. Don't do that one. That one's, I think, worse. Yeah. And like if you're doing like a cord cutting, for example, like watch that candle, because that cord is going to get burned and it's going to go in places that the candle normally wouldn't burn. Yeah, I guess that's my general advice.
Yeah, just like if you're burning something, keep an eye on it. Definitely don't ever leave anything burning unattended, especially if you have herbs on the candle or oil on the candle, or it's like you have something wrapped around it. Just be very mindful, I think, of what you're doing and where you're doing it. With the oil thing, so every single oil that you use has a flash point, and this is essentially the temperature that upon reaching it, it catch on fire and essentially lead to like an oil fire, which is, bad. So looking into the flash points of the oils that you use is really important. The reason why essential oils are really, really bad is because their flash points are really low compared to things like olive oil and grapeseed oil and so on and so forth. So using them on candles is a really terrible idea. And you might think that like, oh, well, the wax is melting, like the flame isn't going to touch the oil, but that's not entirely true. The flame itself is really, really hot. The area near the flame is also really, really hot. It's going to reach really high temperatures really, really quickly. So just be very mindful of that. If you're worried about that, I would definitely consider looking up the flash points of the oils that you're using, just so that you know. Olive oil has a fairly high flash point, so that's pretty safe in general, but don't like oversaturate your candle in olive oil. Use the bare minimum just to be safe. Yeah, I haven't had any like major fire things. That's just because I'm really paranoid. I do remember I did I think it was banishing spell. And I had a bunch of herbs in the bottom, and like I had tied the person's picture to the candle itself that it would burn along and like, be gone, whatever. And that definitely got out of control. Like the paper burning along with the candle, that flame got real large and I was really scared there for a bit. I actually have a stain on my roof, like on my ceiling of my apartment from where I did that spell. So be wary of that as well.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's intense.
How hot was that flame?
They're definitely banished after that. They are gone.
Yeah, it works. So.
I was curious what your emergency plans actually look like. So for me, I burn more incense than anything else, and I have a lot of salt around for that because it kind of acts similarly to sand. So you can just put that on a fire and you can extinguish things with it because it starves the fire of oxygen. So, Phil, you mentioned that you have some water on your altar. What other things do you do to kind of keep safe?
I first of all, now that the weather's getting warmer, especially 95% of the time, if I'm burning anything, I will burn it outside. I burn it outside on the like asphalt or by the dirt where there's no grass, no plants. That is like my number one thing that I do. However, if I do burn candles inside as well. But yeah, I have a lot of little dishes with sand in them. So I will like burn the candle in the sand or near the sand. I have a tripod that I burn a lot of votives on. And I usually, as part of, dressing the candle, I will actually put like a layer of salt around the tripod. Just sort of like almost like layering the levels of the candle will have to hit the water or hit the sand or the salt before XYZ happens. I watch my candles a lot, and I always make sure that if they're not outside, they are being burned in a place where if they fall, it'll either get extinguished by the fall or it will not catch whatever it is on fire. Yeah, that's pretty much mostly what I do.
I also try to burn things outside if I can, just because it's safer in general and I'm not going to burn my apartment down. I have taken to I don't ever put herbs in the kind of like the bottom of anything anymore. And I don't usually dress my candles with herbs anymore. Either just because I have noticed candles going out of control and like I don't feel comfortable with that. So actually a lot of times what I'll do is I have a bowl of salt. I have both salt and sand, but for spells I usually use salt. And I will instead mix my herbs into the salt. and then let the candle burn down that way. So that way the herbs are still being involved with their correspondences, but they're not actually in any kind of position where like they will burn and potentially catch other things on fire. So I found that to be really useful. And then I also have like a marble slate that my mom got. Like, so she bought a whole bunch of stuff from some kitchen company. They sent her this marble cutting board and she didn't want to use it because it was too heavy. And so I took it. And because it's marble, like it won't burn. And so I do a lot of my like candle work on that because it'll catch the wax. It's easy to clean, which is also nice. And if something does fall on it, it won't burn through anything. So I will usually put that on top of my altar. I'm doing it on my altar, or I would actually take that outside too sometimes and burn things on that if necessary. Also cauldron. I have a cauldron and I burn things.
Yeah. Yes. I love burning things in cauldrons. But yeah, you mentioned the herbs. You like will mix them with salt. I actually do that too. If I'm using herbs, I rarely dress candles anymore, but if I do, I will like take my mortar and pestle and grind up the herbs until they're powder, grind some salt in there, and then do like a teaspoon at the most. It's not even, I usually just take a teaspoon and take between my fingers and rub it down the candle. That is enough. Yeah, I used to put herbs when I made candles in the candles. Very bad idea. Don't do that. It looks pretty, but then you've just created another flame point.
Yeah, Phil, could you actually maybe talk about because since you are a candle maker, like, because online we see a lot of candles that are being sold as like spells and they have like all the herbs and stuff being like thrown down them and you have like crystals in them. Can you talk about some of the dangers and like how it affects candles?
Yeah. So when I started making candles, I did stuff like that because I saw it on Etsy and I thought it was pretty. And I learned very quickly. I have a candle. Actually, I think I've banished it now. There's a candle that got a little like, it was scary. It arced and like expanded out. I was like, ah! So at first it was fine because the amount of wax that was in there was able to it didn't catch the herbs on fire at first. And when the herbs were on fire, there was enough wax for it to not really be a problem. But as the candle burned down more and got closer to the bottom, it was more of just burning herbs inside of a very tiny hot dish with 2 wicks. Yeah, I can see your face. You're like, ooh. Yeah, so as it got farther down the candle, it got more and more dangerous. So I think those candles can look very pretty, but if the herbs are not small enough, they won't burn away. And so then they're just going to keep getting caught on fire until you've got a very dangerous situation in your hand. Putting crystals in your candle, I've never done that. I'm of 2 minds of that. I feel like when the candle melts enough, that crystal's going to fall onto one of the wicks and extinguish it at the very least. So I think that's kind of pointless. Depending on the crystal, it shouldn't. Like, that's pretty much mostly what'll happen is it'll just extinguish things. But I could also foresee it, depending on what the crystal is, that crystal, like, exploding. Depending on the candle. It also matters what the candle's made of. I primarily work with beeswax because beeswax is pretty low temperature, and beeswax is often cut with olive oil or coconut oil because it tunnels a lot, which basically means that it just burns straight down where the wick is because beeswax is so low temperature. So the coconut oil like mixes it in and lets it burn more evenly. So beeswax is probably one of the safest of the candle options because it's a low temperature point. Paraffin is really the one where things can get real dicey real fast. Not only has paraffin seen sometimes as an air pollutant, it can also really make that fire go crazy if you have other things attached to it. I'm not versed in soy, so I can't really speak about soy candles, but I believe soy is similar to beeswax, which has a lower burn temperature.
I was just thinking that the other benefit of using salt rather than sand, not that there's anything wrong with sand, is that you can collect ash in it and then use that as black salt later. So it's just kind of like a nice way of recycling things, and it maybe feels like a little bit lower waste. Although your safety is a priority, and it should never feel like a waste to protect yourself.
Okay, great. Let's move on to talk about herbs. All right. So this is definitely more like Hanne's territory than it is my territory. So I'll let her kind of be the primary speaker. But I did separate this into a couple different categories that we can touch upon, and some of the hazards that they fall into, which I identified as foraging and identification, ingestion / topical application, and then also burning. So Hanne, if you want to talk about foraging.
So the first thing you want to think about is actually where you're foraging. This is obviously going to be more difficult for people who live in cities, but there are dangers for everybody. So just bear in mind that everything you forage, you need to wash. This is because there might be pollutants on that, either that being from farmland or from cars, any kind of city dust. It could also be from animals urinating on the foraged items. People don't really think about that, but that's a real danger. And you can actually look up the soil pollution details in your area to kind of get a sense of how safe things are. Washing things will not get rid of all the pollutants. There's a common misconception. Some plants will actually take up pollutants into their leaves. So just washing them will not get rid of everything, which means you either need to not forage in that area. You can test the soil with a heavy metal test, but if you don't know what you're doing with that, don't do it. It's kind of the preliminary message of this episode, I think. And the other thing is, if you're very experienced and you have your own land that you know has some pollutant, you can actually bioremediate it. So I have a friend who's passed on some resources for this. Basically, what this involves is you can grow plants that you know take up heavy metals. So that might be something like sunflowers. And then you don't use those sunflowers. Those are simply used for, compost, things like that. And then your land has been kind of purified by the sunflowers, and you can use that for growing things further on. So it's kind of a nice way of, I guess, interacting with the land and also detoxifying things in basically making them safer for you. Did you guys do any foraging, or is it just me who's into the?
I do a lot of foraging.
Oh, you do? That's so cool.
Yeah, I do a lot of foraging. I actually live in the city. It'll be exciting. Maybe we'll do another episode after I take this course, but I'm doing a course with one of the urban foragers in my area, which should be a lot of fun. I actually just got my soil tested. It was funny. The check was deposited today for the soil test, because basically what I ended up doing, for anyone who's curious. So unfortunately, a lot of the soil tests that you buy online don't test for heavy metals. They only test like the pH. So those you generally won't do. But I encourage you to look at your local universities. So one of the universities in my area, their ecology lab, I think, does soil tests specifically for lead, which is probably the biggest one, but they do like for other heavy metals as well. And in general too, they'll get the pH back as they do the test anyways, and they'll make recommendations based on that in general. So what I ended up doing, just for anyone who wants to know what that looks like, is I went around to where we're planning on growing things in my garden, and I dug, I think about 6 inches down. It was something like 6 to 8 inches down. And I took scoops of soil, and they wanted like 6 different samples from around the property. And I put it all in a bucket. I mixed it around, let it dry, took out any gravel, any plant as best as I could. And then I shipped it off to the lab, and then they're going to test. It was around a cup of soil. So then they're going to test and let me know. And one thing that's also important to keep in mind, and what, some of these places that test for heavy metal will tell you, is that some properties do have small margins of lead in the soil. There is a certain level of lead that is actually like tolerable. Generally though, your soil won't set off the heavy metal thing unless it's high enough. I believe one of the things is, if your house was made before it's in the 1970s. But yeah, I'll circle back to that one. If your house is prior to that law passed in like the mid 70s, that is something you should look into. Like if your house was built before then or painted before then, there could be trace amounts of lead that have gotten into the property. Although if your house is built after that and you don't live in the city or really close to like major highways, you should be good, because the paint is not lead based. At least that is how it pertains in America, I should say. But yeah, when I forage in the city, I only go into parks. I never go along the little freeway there, which is sad, because there are some beautiful, wonderful not blooming, but they're just so ripe, the wild garlic. And I'm just like, oh, you're tempting, but you're right by the side of the road. So that's something to keep in mind, as well as plant IDs. I think in general, unless you're trained in it, you should not forage for mushrooms.
I agree. I completely agree.
That's my hot take. Now, one can make the argument like chicken in the woods or hen of the woods is like pretty identifiable, but in general, just leave the mushrooms. Mushrooms, in order to even confirm that it is, like, you can't even confirm by looking at some of them. You have to do like a spore print test. Don't forage mushrooms.
I want to come back to the areas that are safe to forage in. So there are some other things that you should bear in mind before you go out to a particular area to forage. One is whether there are any local laws. So that might be whether it's, in the UK, they call them sites of special scientific interest. Basically, they're kind of nature reserves, places where there are protected species, protected environments. So you shouldn't forage there. There might also be public health warnings. So on the beaches here, sometimes they have algal blooms. So it's usually safe to forage things, but when there's an algal bloom, they can produce toxins in the water. That means it's not safe to take things from. So you need to kind of constantly check. It's a dynamic thing, right? Environments need to be monitored constantly. And the other thing my foraging book specifically says, and this is UK specific, is that if you're not experienced, then you shouldn't forage near water. And this is because lots of poisonous species like water hemlock are commonly found near water, things like Adam and Eve's as well. And they can be confused with lots of other species which are not toxic. So water hemlock, 6 to 8 leaves could kill you. Famously was used to poison Socrates, but it can commonly be confused with cow parsley. So it's very, very, very easy to mix those up. And if you're not experienced, you don't know what you're doing, just don't do it. Choose something safe. Choose a kind of beginner plant to forage rather than going straight to a risky area.
If you're looking to forage and you live in eastern United States, look at wild garlic. It's so abundant here. I don't know why. I just love to hear it, and it's delicious. And it's very easy to identify.
I didn't even look for it then because someone posted a recipe in one of the Discord servers that we're in, and it was all about like wild garlic, and I was like, oh shit. I want to go find some so I can go make this recipe.
It's so good. I have so much of it.
It's really good. I just made some pesto with it actually. For wild garlic specifically, you should make sure that you individually harvest leaves though, because it does grow in the same soil type as lily of the valley, which is toxic, and also wild hellebore, which is also toxic. So make sure that you individually check the leaves that they smell of garlic, because you could be harvesting something which is similar.
One of my other things with foraging is it's very rewarding. There's so many books on like your specific local plant life, and I honestly think that one of the best ways to honor the land is to get to know the plants around you, even if they're not edible and you don't want to touch them. There's joy, I don't know, that I get from being able to like identify a plant, and I'm like, oh, and then I see it somewhere else and I'm like, oh, I know what that is. And like you really get to know the plants of your area, and it just makes the work that I do so much more rewarding and personal, I guess.
Along those lines, do you guys have any like plant identification apps that you would recommend? I know I spoke with Nike because I know she forages a lot, and she recommended Picture This and iNaturalist. If you have others, this is probably a good time to throw them in.
I use Picture This. Picture This is phenomenal.
I use PlantNet. So iNaturalist, I think you can do plants and also things like mushrooms. PlantNet is just for plants. My experience is it's very slightly better at identifying plants, but obviously you're kind of limited in that you can only do plants, you can't do other species. It's also got a really nice system. I'm not sure if the other apps have this, but it's got like a peer ranking system, so people can come and confirm your identification and rate them, suggest new names. So it's a really good way of, if somebody has just like blatantly misidentified something, then you can get some confirmation from people maybe with a bit more experience.
I guess one of the things that I want to touch on, just this is like from an American perspective, and I guess this also can apply to other colonized lands, is be mindful of the people who live there and are the sort of the people who originally protected and harvested from the land. One of the things that I try to support my local tribes when I do foraging specifically as a form of giving back. And a lot of them will have donation sites. Some of them will even accept volunteer work if they accept that. Not all of them do. That's just something I encourage. If you live on colonized land, I encourage you to learn from and listen to the local tribes. And, they host, at least here where I am in New England, they will host these panels where they talk about the plants and how they originally worked with them, how they work with them now, what it looks like to be a good steward of the land, especially in the face of climate change and just the devastation that it has brought. So I encourage you, if you do forage on occupied land, to listen to and respect and hear the voices of the original folks who tended this land before.
That's a really, really, really good point. And even if you don't live somewhere like that, it kind of brings up another point. You need to think about over-harvesting. So what the kind of etiquette, at least in my foraging book, it says that you should never take more than half of what you find. And if something is not very abundant, the best thing is just not to pick it at all. So an example was that I was foraging recently and I came across some English violets. And although they seem to be quite abundant in the area, I happen to know that they suffer from overharvesting. So I was like, you know what? Even though I love violets, I think they're great, if they're like glamour things, and they're great to making candies and syrups. I can leave these because it's better for the environment to have these and the bees to use them than it is for me to make a syrup or whatever out of them. So just be mindful of like what you're taking and how much you're taking, and if you can, like, give back wherever. Like, I think Phil makes a really, really good point.
Okay. If you could see our outline, you would see that we have a couple of things in capital letters, which is like yelling at you through the screen. And those are double check the plant ID. Please make sure that you know what you're working with. I think we've touched upon the danger of that a couple of times, but it is crucial to know that what you have and what you're going to, like, if you're going to use it in something, that you actually have what you think you do. So please double check the plant ID. If you aren't sure, don't eat it, don't touch it. Like, if you aren't sure, just don't do anything with it. Just leave it be. And move on to something else. Those are kind of the things that we are yelling at you through the screen to be very mindful of.
Oh, I scrolled down through the thing and remembered one thing. When you're foraging, never touch moss or lichen. Leave it alone. Do not take moss or lichen. Let it grow, especially lichen. I know lichen is beautiful, but do not take it. Takes a long time to grow, and it is so beneficial to that local ecosystem, and moss as well. I know moss is beautiful. I love moss deeply, but let it grow. Don't take it.
If you want it, grow your own. In fact, you can grow your own moss at home.
Grow your own.
So it's better that you do that than
moss.
Steal it from the local ecosystem.
That was just the last thing I wanted.
Hanne, you've got a lot written here. Do you want to cover some of it?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as Astra mentioned, make sure that you double check the plant ID. Again, if you're not sure, so you can start off checking with an app, check with your foraging book, check with the local community. And that's actually a really, really good way to get acquainted. I know obviously in COVID times, it's not as easy to join kind of local events, but wherever you can, if you can find a community, and even online, to double check things with, it will help to make you a lot safer. So another thing to mention is that don't just use like witchy resources. I think we've mentioned this in our Magic of Research episode, but you should definitely be using things like farmers' almanacs and scholarly resources wherever you can, because they're going to have botanical illustrations that give you the best representation. Choosing somebody's anecdotal evidence, which might be heavily localized to their area, is not a good idea. When you get to actually preparing something from a herb, you need to think about the part of the plant that you're using. So, for example, it can be really valuable to take the flowers from elder, but the leaves and the twigs can be somewhat more toxic. So you need to pay attention to the part of the plant, because some of those might contain toxic compounds and others might be really useful. The actual method of preparation also matters. So oxalis, for example, has lots of oxalic acid in, funnily enough, and those tubers can be eaten, but they have to be cooked in a specific way to get rid of those oxalic acid crystals. So just make sure that you know what you're doing. Don't just think, okay, well, this says it's edible, and then go ahead and eat it, because there are completely different effects depending on the part of the plant that you ingest. The time of year also matters. So when you're identifying something, just make sure that it should be in bloom, it should be in leaf at the time that you're looking. If you find something, I found some clary sage, for example, the other day, and PlantNet said, oh, this could be clary sage, or it could be foxglove. Foxglove is obviously, obviously very, very poisonous, right? So what I can do is I can be patient and I can wait a few weeks. And if that comes up in flowers, the foxglove flowers are going to be very distinctive. That's going to differentiate it really easily from clary sage. So again, if you don't know, don't eat it. And I keep repeating that, but watching and waiting and actually paying attention to your local environment throughout the year is a really useful way of keeping yourself safe. And then I finally want to talk about actually testing things. So you want to be really, really careful. When you're testing things, your sense of taste and smell can be useful, but make sure that you're wearing PPE when you're doing that initially. So when you're touching things like things that could be hemlock, you should wear gloves. And this is because they can cause a photosensitive reaction. So it might not initially hurt, but then later when you go into the sunlight, you then get a photosensitive reaction, starts to blister and burn. There's also obviously things like thorns. And finally, like with wild garlic, smelling it is a really useful way of differentiating it from the other plants. But you could bruise the leaves of something and then get something nasty. Like in the US, you have poison ivy, for example. You don't really want that on your hands. Oh, God. Yeah, we don't have that here actually, but I feel quite lucky.
The worst feeling ever is having poison ivy.
You can taste test, but only do it if you absolutely 100% know what it is that you are testing. The way that people teach you to do it is to put a very, very tiny amount in your mouth first and then spit it out. Wait for an hour and see if you've had a reaction. If that seems okay, then you can ingest a small amount, swallow it, and then wait another half an hour or so, and just keep testing small amounts to see if you have a reaction, because just because it says edible doesn't mean that you personally won't be allergic, and it's always better safe than sorry.
Or certain things like pine needle tea, which, first of all, pine needle tea is great. However, if you live in a place where yew is very common, like I do, I only basically, if I make pine needle tea, it's only from my Christmas tree because I know it's balsam fir. And even there, you don't want to have too much pine needle tea because you won't die if you have too much pine needle tea, but you won't feel great. But yeah, so certain things, like even if they are edible, that doesn't mean eat a lot of it indiscriminately.
Yeah, that's a good point. I collected gorse as well, and like that's got loads of alkaloids in the flowers. But you're probably not going to eat like a pound of gorse flowers. But I mean, just bear that in mind when you're ingesting something. Like the amount does really matter.
And I want to touch on something kind of like from even I have some pharmaceutical like background. This is something that we talk about quite frequently, and that is a cross reaction. I am going to warn people that I'm going to get a little scientific here because I went a little overboard into like looking into this mechanism. But I thought it was fascinating, and I'm going to share it because I'm a scientist. It's what we do. So cross reactions aren't really something people consider when engaging with herbal remedies. But when you use a plant for tea, or you put it into a salve, or however you intend to use it, you're working with the chemicals that they contain. And these have effects in your body. It's why sometimes certain herbal remedies make you feel different, or can help with certain symptoms that you have. And because of this, they can also interfere with other pharmaceuticals. The best example that I came across here, the one that's been most like well studied, is St. John's wort, which is a natural antidepressant. And as a tea, it can be a great way to boost your mood because it enhances the release of like happy neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, so on and so forth. But because of the mechanism behind that, it is also known for decreasing the efficacy of a lot of prescription medications. And if taken in a high enough dosage, can have adverse side effects. This is where I'm going to get sciencey, so I apologize if I put you to sleep. The chemical basis behind this comes from one molecule in particular, which is hyperforin. Now, hyperforin is a high affinity ligand. This means that it binds very tightly to the human pregnane xenobiotic receptor. This receptor is a nuclear receptor expressed in the liver and intestine that essentially mediates the induction of xenobiotic metabolizing enzymes and efflux transporter gene transcription. Let me break that down. A xenobiotic metabolizing enzyme is an enzyme that recognizes foreign substances in your body and essentially digests them so that they can be excreted from your body safely. And an efflux transporter is something that will, if something enters into your cell and it's foreign and it's not supposed to be there, these efflux transporters are good at recognizing that and then forcing them back out to essentially to protect you. So why does all this matter? Hyperforin is the most potent activator of the pregnane xenobiotic receptor. So it has an EC, and for those of you who are scientists, this will make a little bit more sense, but it has an EC50 of 23 nanomolars. Now, this is really, really, really low. This means that at a very, very low concentration, it has a very, very intense effect. And its half-life, meaning how long it stays kind of in its initial form in your bloodstream and how quickly it's eliminated, it has a half-life of 8 to 12 hours, which is also fairly long for a molecule. Some molecules have half-lives of like, maybe 30 to 45 minutes. So 8 to 12 hours is pretty long for a molecule. And the issue with that is that this long half-life can lead to a lot of accumulation over time, especially if you're doing something like drinking St. John wort's tea, where consistently ingesting this molecule, it can grow in concentration. And given that it requires such a small concentration to activate these receptors, that can be really problematic. These xenobiotic metabolizing enzymes are the ones that break down foreign material, like I said earlier, and this includes drugs. And so enhancing their activity and also enhancing the activity of the efflux transporters, it essentially pumps out drugs that get into your system right back out. So you lower their overall efficacy. You essentially prevent them from getting to their targets. And the xenobiotic metabolizing enzymes, because they're activated and more are being produced, you essentially break them down, and so they're unable to even reach your cells. So basically, St. John's wort can lead to decreased oral bioavailability, meaning that they don't actually get to their intended target. enhanced systemic clearance. They don't last as long in your bloodstream as they might from like what we know scientifically with like serum stability studies. And they have reduced efficiency because again, they can't get to their target. So that's like an instance of an herb that, you know, people might not think actually has much of an effect, has a really big effect and can severely decrease the efficiency of medications. It's a really big issue with birth control. This is something that's been studied pretty frequently, and there's a lot of references on it. I can include a few in the description below if you're curious. But all of this to say, you should consult with your doctor first before engaging in any kind of herbal remedy that could potentially interact and interfere with other drugs. Some of these reactions are really dangerous and can lead to death. So I can't stress the importance of checking and how important that is. Please consult your doctor. Don't think you know better than a medical professional. They are trained in understanding cross reactions, and they can tell you. And even if they don't know off the top of their head, they have the background to do the research and understand kind of the science behind any cross reaction. So please, I'm begging you, go talk to your doctor before you do any kind of herbal remedy that could influence the current medications that you're taking.
That's a really, really good point. That's actually really interesting because I knew that St. John's wort did interact, but I actually didn't know the mechanism. So it's really interesting to hear what it is.
I found it very fascinating. And actually, I sent Hanne this paper, but I will also include it in the description box below. The paper looks at some very common herbs that are used in society and looks at their mechanisms of action within our bodies and how they do interact with different pharmaceutics. If you're curious, go read it. Fair warning, it is a science paper, so it's going to have a lot of that terminology. But hey, if you're interested and you aren't a scientist, like see if you can make sense of it. I found it very, very interesting.
I was devastated that I couldn't eat grapefruit anymore when I started my new meds because it interferes with cytochrome P450 in your liver. So basically, it again decreases the bioavailability, which is really, really annoying. So if you're on certain medications, you should not be eating grapefruit. It's pretty amazing how our food can affect us.
Yeah, it's crazy. Absolutely insane. Okay, let's move on to burning. So again,
one last thing for ingestion. I think this is said a lot, but I don't think it's said enough. Don't ingest anything that is like a flying ointment tincture. I have seen people make tinctures out of herbs traditionally found in flying ointment, which are all poisonous. Do not ingest them. Don't ingest it. Don't ingest henbane. Don't ingest, or what is one of the belladonna. But yeah, just don't ingest. I know people sell flying tinctures. Just, err on the side of caution. And same thing with like going back to what I said earlier about certain things, like if you have too much of it, it can cause or it can make you feel kind of weird. Mugwort is one of those things, as well as wormwood. Err on the side of caution. If you have a womb and you have your period, mugwort can make that happen.
Mugwort can fuck up your that whole cycle, so just be careful. If you're pregnant, it can cause you to miscarry. Like check the herb, check the properties, make sure you're being safe.
Yeah.
On that same note, if you do make a tincture, please label it with what you use, so that you don't have fly ointment and forget that you included all these toxic plants. Labeling to make sure that you know what's going on later is super, super important. So,
or a doctor needs to see what you've taken if you need to go to the hospital later.
If you do something that causes you to almost die, letting them know what was in what you took will be helpful. It'll give them a better basis for how to treat you. Good point.
Oh, I see. We on our list, I don't think we talk about salves at all, but that's fine. When you're using salves, just note that if you put it on your wrist, that is going straight into your system. It'll take a bit, but it'll get there. So be mindful. That's why I think back in the early 2000s, people were freaking out about people writing things on their wrists. I don't actually know any merit of that, but I remember that was the main reason is if you put things there, it will go into your system slowly, but it will get there very strongly. So be mindful what you put on those places of your body where there are a lot of veins, like your wrists, your neck and ankles, anywhere where there's a lot of blood flow and very thin skin layer.
General kind of rule of thumb there, if you can see the veins through your skin in that particular area, you probably shouldn't put anything on it. Or if you do, be aware that it will be absorbed much more quickly than if you were to say to put on your legs. Okay, now we'll move to burning. I have in big bold letters to double check the plant ID. Are you sick of us saying that? It's important. Double check the plant ID. The other thing is to check if it's even suitable to burn. Okay, so we love to burn things in the witchy community, but some herbs release combustion products that are toxic to humans and animals, and some just the burning can be dangerous. For example, we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but plants like poison ivy, poison sumac, and poison oak contain an oil called urushiol, and is that how you pronounce it? I don't even know. Anyways, and this is what leads to the irritation on your skin. It's what causes those bumps and those lesions. But when burned, you can also inhale the smoke and the oil, and that can irritate your nasal passages, your lungs, and cause swelling. So, like, that's something that you should be mindful of. I know something else that people don't think about, but it is a problem, is cinnamon. So, while not being harmful when ingested, except in large quantities, please don't do that. It can be flammable under the right conditions. Cinnamon comes from the dried bark of the Cinnamomum verum. Is that how you pronounce that? Latin names, they're important. People, we should know them. And its flavor and smell can be attributed to two specific chemicals, cinnamaldehyde and eugenol. Now, if you're a chemist and you recognize kind of the functional groups a part of these molecules, the alcohol and the aldehyde, these are both very volatile chemicals. And it's one of the reasons why cinnamon is so fragrant, but those compounds are also highly combustible. So for instance, if you were going to like sprinkle cinnamon over a flame, it would combust and you would get a larger flame. So please be careful when you're working with like ground cinnamon. Cinnamon sticks, I would say, are a little bit safer, but like burning will still release these chemicals. So it's just not safe to burn cinnamon. Please don't. Please don't do it. All of this to say, just be very careful about the herbs that you're burning and make sure that if you burn them, they don't release anything that could be toxic to you. Always check beforehand.
You guys mentioned burning things outside a lot, and I think that's really good advice, because if you're not sure about something, at least then you're burning it in kind of an environment where you've got lots of ventilation. Whereas if you're burning it in an enclosed space where you're going to get overwhelmed very quickly, maybe you have pets who are going to get overwhelmed, it just gets very dangerous very quickly. So if you're kind of not sure about something, you can't find very much information about it, ideally you shouldn't be burning it anyway. But at least if you're going to do it somewhere where there's a lot of ventilation and you're not going to risk inhaling large quantities of it.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, now we're going to get to my favorite part, which is chemicals. Okay, people, don't burn chemicals. Don't do it. I don't care what it is. Don't burn the chemicals, okay? Any chemical that has... Okay, well, let me back up a little bit. First of all, if you can't define a reaction for what you are going to try and burn, don't burn it, okay? Like, bad things can happen. Don't do it.
Wow.
I can't stress this enough. Like, the number of people that have burned chemicals and like things have exploded in their faces. I read a story about a laboratory in the University of Washington where they burned, well, they didn't intentionally do it, but there was an unknown chemical in this like jar by an open flame. It caught fire and the lab exploded and it almost burned down. Like, I'm not kidding. These stuff is dangerous. Like, please be careful. Any chemical that has a hazard must have something called a safety data sheet, or an SDS, in compliance with OSHA regulations. Now, these SDSs contain information about the chemical, about associated hazards, handling, reactivity, disposal guidance, and so on. If you're going to be using something that could be hazardous, please check to see if you can find an SDS for it. You probably can. There are literally so many of them. I would know because I've had to write so many of them, and give it a look through. It's so much better to be prepared, as chemical reactions can sometimes go really wrong really, really fast. There was somebody in one of the Discord servers we're in. I'm bringing this up because it like just made me want to die inside. And they had dyes used, I think, for pottery, and they were trying to combine them to create like a crystal. Listen, that is not safe to do in your garage. The people who do these things and like make synthetic crystals or other synthetic materials, they're trained and they have the proper SDS. They have the PPE that's necessary for these reactions. If you don't have that and you don't have the training, don't do it. I don't care how cool it looks in the YouTube video. Don't do it, okay? Please, I'm begging you as a chemist, like, don't do it. Okay, that's it. I'm done ranting.
Another common one is sulfur, because that was used to purify in ancient Greece. So a lot of people think they can burn sulfur, but it releases sulfur dioxide, which is very irritating to your lungs. I actually happen to have a bag of sulfur with me today.
Nice.
Because my granddad was a chemist and he had a whole load of chemicals in the garage from the days before safety was quite as rigorous as it is. So I had to dispose of these through the proper chemical means in the lab. And it's just ridiculous how people manage to get their hands on things and think they can just treat it willy-nilly. But we have to treat these in a very, very specific way in the lab, and there's a reason for that. We have also specific places like a fume hood where we can deal with these in a way that doesn't expose us to all the harmful chemicals that might eventuate from reactions. So
Don't mess around with the chemicals. Don't do it. I need to calm down. I think our next topic. Oh, actually, Hanne, did you want to touch upon this essential oil comment?
There's a book called The Chemistry of Fragrance, which is quite nice, which I would really recommend, because I think if you're going to make essential oils, if you're going to go down that path of heating up compounds and trying to distill things which might be flammable and generating chemical reactions, it's a good idea to know what you're doing before you set out to do it. Even if you don't really feel like you know a lot about chemistry, this book is really good because it gives you a really good basic overview. There's some history in there, there's basic chemistry in there, it's a really good instructional guide. So my advice is, if you want to start out, at least have a foundation in the kind of science that's happening so you can assess the risk more readily. So that's my reading recommendation for this episode.
Okay, now we're going to move into crystals. Yay. I also have a lot written here, so bear with me. It's also going to get a little sciencey again, so just fair warning. We often hear a lot of people warn against putting water-soluble crystals in water. But what does that exactly mean? Okay, what is happening on a chemical level is that water is a polar substance, meaning that it has an uneven distribution of electrons across the molecule. The oxygen is more electronegative than the hydrogens, and we represent this by saying the oxygen has a partial negative charge and the hydrogens have a partial positive charge. The kind of non-scientific way to say this is that oxygen is being a bully and is essentially taking the electrons from the hydrogens to itself because it's greedy. You've also probably heard the term, well, it's not a term, it's a phrase really, that likes dissolve likes, which means that something that is highly polar will be dissolved in something else that is polar. Water, again, is polar, but something non-polar won't dissolve in a polar solvent or solution. So when it comes to crystals, if it ends in ite, I-T-E, keep it out of water. And the reasoning is because a lot of popular crystals like fluorite, selenite, calcite, and halite are made from minerals that are ionic. Now, what is the difference between ionic and polar? Ionic means that you've got species with specific charges being attracted to one another electrostatically, similar to positive pole of a magnet being attracted to the negative pole, same kind of idea. The difference is that because these molecules are held together by charge in their crystalline lattice structure, that can easily be disrupted by water, which again has this uneven distribution of electrons, leading to two separate quote-unquote charges on the same molecule. Basically, the water comes in and it begins to interact with the different parts of these minerals. For example, the oxygen of the water might interact with the calcium 2+ ion in fluorite, and it causes it to dissolve. So why is this bad? Well, this is kind of an extreme example, but on the off chance that you have some sulfuric acid just lying around, which you shouldn't have, so if you do, I'm a little concerned, and you mistake it for water and drop fluorite in, you'll produce hydrofluoric acid and you'll die. Case in point, you'll be dead. I said that's a little dramatic, and it is, because hopefully no one has that, but when you put a crystal that ends in ITE in a specific volume of water and let it sit for a specific length of time, more of these, if we're taking fluorite, for example, more of these fluorine ions will dissolve and the concentration will increase over time. If you were to ingest the solution at a high enough concentration, high levels of fluorine are bad. We know this even, outside of the chemical reasoning. So if you ingest this at a high enough concentration, you could cause severe health issues for yourself. And this is the case for pretty much any crystal that ends in an ITE. At a high enough concentration, the products that they break down to when exposed to water are toxic to you. Other crystals like pyrite and hematite, when react with water, result in the formation of sulfate and iron hydroxides, which is rust. Don't drink rusty water. I think that should be a good one. And even to note here as well is that even if you can't see the rust, that doesn't mean the rust isn't there. Okay? You might not be able to visualize it, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. So just don't drink it. Don't put it in water and don't drink it. Okay? And the last thing I have to say is talking about insoluble crystals in water. At this point, can we just agree not to put crystals in water? Anyways, let's get into the reason. So insoluble crystals won't dissolve in water, but they still shouldn't be put into your water or any solution that you intend on drinking because the surface could be dirty and could be harboring a lot of microscopic organisms like bacteria. You don't know what's on it unless you want to stick it onto an agar plate and see what grows. If you do this, just know you will probably be disgusted. Those microorganisms will contaminate your water, and then if you ingest it, you are ingesting those microorganisms. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Furthermore, these crystals, again, they won't dissolve, but a lot of crystals sometimes have microfractures in them, and so they could chip in such small places that you don't actually see those chips floating in solution, and so you can't filter them out. And so if you drink it and then you ingest these chips of crystal, that could also be really damaging to your stomach lining, to your intestines, and so on. Okay, so case in point of that entire conversation, don't put crystals in water. Ever. Don't do it. It's not worth it. If you want to charge crystals with water or charge water with crystals, put them around whatever vessel you're using. There are ways to do it without putting them in water. The crystal water bottles that I've seen around sometimes the witchy communities, please don't. It's not safe unless the crystals are somehow separated from the water that you're drinking. But just again, don't put crystals in water for all of the reasons that we mentioned previously.
Also, this shouldn't need to be said, but don't put crystals in any of your orifices because of the same reason for bacteria. I feel like this has been covered extensively in media by a gynecologist called Dr. Jen Gunter, but just to reiterate, do not put them in any orifices because you could get toxic shock syndrome, and you can die from that actually.
Yeah, so when you put something inside yourself, if you were to, which you shouldn't, please don't. A lot of those areas, those membranes are much more, they absorb things much more quickly than it would be if you rubbed it onto your skin. That's why it's so dangerous, because you're exposing it, especially if it ends in ITE, your areas that are lubricated produce polar-based substances that will dissolve these crystals, and then the byproducts will be absorbed into your body, which is bad and can lead to things becoming very toxic very quickly. Don't do it. Okay, don't do it. But okay, and I've ranted enough about crystals, so let's move on. I think the last thing we're going to talk about is the less specific topic, our essential oils.
Yeah. So speaking of essential oils, I told my lovely co-hosts that I had quite the experience with essential oils. Oh, was it last weekend or was the weekend before that maybe? So before I get into that fun story, err on the side of infused oils or pre-diluted oils than 100% essential oils. And if you have pets, I swear to God, the amount of times I've seen this happen where people will be like, oh, I'm burning this essential oil, and they're like, oh, look at this cute picture of my cat, and I'm like, oh my God, no. So essential oils are not able to be processed by animals. They breathe it in and it goes straight to their nervous system, and they can die very easily, especially certain kinds of essential oils. Certain kinds of essential oils are super deadly to pets. But in general, all essential oils have the potential to be toxic to animals. Every single one of them. Just because of the way that they are made. And so in general, if you really want to use essential oils, use them outside. I saw someone was, I knocked over this statue and I want to re-bless it, and so I covered it in essential oils, and they were like, oh, my cat was the one who knocked it over. And I was like, no, if they get that on their fur, it won't go away for a long time. Animals' fur, the general rule of thumb is if you can smell the scent on your animal's fur, it's too strong, because things stick to their fur, and they want to, cats specifically want to smell like cat. So they will groom themselves until they smell like cat, which means that they are taking in all of those particles that have stuck to them. So if you have pets, err on the side of no essential oils. My fun experience with essential oils a few weekends ago. So I had pennyroyal essential oil, 100% essential oil. Pennyroyal is part of the mint family. and I was using it because pennyroyal is good at keeping bugs away, specifically from like a natural perspective, specifically ants. Pennyroyal is also toxic, very toxic to cats, so I also should have been way more careful about this. But I was getting ready to fill up the thing. I was going to go burn it outside. I was going to go outside so that way to ward off the wasps and say, hey, don't make your nest here, please. I spilled it all over my hands.
Oh no.
And my arms too, which meant that it got all over my clothes. And for like the next 30 minutes, everything I touched, even when I washed my hands in warm water, like that didn't get rid of it. Everything I touched smelled like pennyroyal. And very, very strong. And it got to the point where I actually had to sleep on the couch. I had to turn on baking soda. Baking soda is an odor neutralizer, and coffee is another odor neutralizer. I had all of those things just strewn about my room. I washed all of my sheets because I went down to take a nap, and I woke up and I was just like covered in rashes from the essential oil that I had touched the bed. Touched my covers and gotten it on myself. I took a hot shower and I put on my air purifier and I shut the room, and I like fed my cat outside the room because I was like, there is too much happening here. And like I've been working with essential oils for years and years now, and just even though I wasn't even going to burn it inside, I just the spilling of it all over my hands, it was like a disaster. And like I was coughing so much because pennyroyal is super strong in general, and my lungs were not having it. I had to literally like sit outside and purify my whole body. And I washed all my clothes, and it was just a nightmare. So in general, err on the side of not essential oils if you can. And that's the sad tale of woe.
A good thing to do as well is to make sure that you have your essential oils diluted, because a lot of them can be very, very irritating to your skin. This particularly applies to things like cinnamon. That can be very, very irritating to certain people. And also to citron oils, so things like lemon-based oils. They are photosensitizing in the same way I mentioned about hemlock can be. So you might not notice, oh, you put it on your skin, you put it in the back of your neck, and it feels fine, but you go out in the sun, and then you have like a really nasty blister on the back of your neck. So either wear it diluted or patch test it first on a kind of inconspicuous area that's away from the sun. And another thing you can do if you're not sure is you can actually wear it on a phylactery. So I have one of these. It's like a kind of scent locket type necklace. You can get them quite cheaply. It's a little sort of bottle that you can wear around your neck. So you can have kind of be wearing the oil, wearing the properties of the plant without actually physically wearing it on your skin. And it's a lot safer that way than having something that could potentially react badly to you or your pet.
Yeah, and I want to talk really quickly about some dilution protocols. Again, this might get a little sciencey. Sorry, I am like all about the science today. So if you know the concentration, and sometimes if you buy essential oils, they will actually tell you the concentration of the oil within. So if you know it, you can do a simple dilution with like our favorite M1V1 equals M2V2 equation. This is probably the simplest and the easiest method. So then you can achieve a very specific concentration simply by diluting with water or another substance. If you don't, however, I would recommend doing something called a serial dilution. This is probably your kind of next best bet. 10x serial dilutions are the easiest. Also, I would say probably the most popular. And essentially what that means is you would take 1/10 of your initial stock solution, which would be the essential oil, and in kind of its pure form, and you would add it to another tube, and then add another solution to dilute it to a specific volume. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we're working with lemon essential oil. Yeah. So you have the lemon essential oil in its pure form, and you want to perform a serial dilution to find the concentration that doesn't burn your skin. And you would do this by patch testing, not spraying it all over your body the first time. Okay. So you would take 1 ml of your essential oil, and then you would add 9 ml of water for a total of 10 ml. So this is your first 10x dilution. That means instead of going from, let's say you have like 100 millimolar, divide that by 10, now you have 10 millimolar. These concentrations are really high, by the way. They would probably not ever be this high, but I'm just using it for example. So that's solution 2. And then you're going to take 1 ml from solution 2, and you're going to put it into another like tube, and you're going to add 9 more mils of water. Now we've diluted it 10 times again. So that 10 millimolar solution is now a 1 millimolar solution. And you would keep doing that. And each time you could patch test that on your skin to see if it burns. If it burns, do another dilution until it reaches a point where it doesn't burn. I would actually recommend maybe going 2 dilutions past the point where it's not burning, just so that you know it really is like safe at that concentration. Yes, and I actually have a very easy guide to cereal dilutions I will include below in the description. So if you want to do this, that should also be a good starting point for you. Which means that we're going to move on to the second part of this, which is ingesting essential oils. Okay. I'm also really passionate about this, so I apologize if I get a little worked up. That shit is concentrated, okay? It is in its pure
Don't
oil
do it.
form. Like that is it's concentrated stuff. So please don't think that it's the same as like dropping a drop of lemon juice in your water. Like not the same thing at all. Dropping like one drop of lemon essential oil is like dropping 50 lemon peels into your water, okay? It's like
Jesus.
it's really, really, really concentrated. Because of that, they should be treated a lot more like a medicine and handled appropriately with like dosaging, keeping that in mind. Quite frankly, you just like shouldn't ingest it at all because it's not safe. Also recognize that they're oils, right? And because they're oils, that means that they're non-polar and they're not going to dissolve in a polar solution, which would be like water. So if you take essential oil and you drop it into water, it's not going to dissolve in the water. You're going to have oil droplets in water. So if you were to then drink said solution, the oil isn't going to go down with water. Instead, it's going to actually bind to the mucosal membrane of your throat because your mucus is nonpolar. Well, it's a mixture of polar and nonpolar. But the nonpolar parts of it will bind to the nonpolar oil. And so instead of being washed down to your stomach with the water, it's going to bind there and it could lead to burning and irritation. Okay, don't drink essential oils, please. You have no reason to. If you want your water to taste like lemon, just put in some lemon juice, okay?
If you do want to dilute something safely, so for example, the cereal dilution example we used before, some really good carrier oils are sweet almond oil. It does have a little bit of a smell of itself. Fractionated coconut oil is another good one. Some people do react to this, so just make sure, again, that you patch test it. Some people use olive oil. I find that the smell of olive oil is actually a little bit too strong. Do you guys use any carrier oils? Or
I think grapeseed.
I know jojoba oil. Grapeseed and jojoba oil are both really. Jojoba oil is really expensive though.
Yeah.
It's also a little
It was very
expensive, but
good.
it's not as expensive as jojoba oil. I found, and it doesn't
Right.
have any like severe smell like olive oil either, so it's a pretty good. I use that in a lot of my like alchemical workings, and it works pretty well.
One last thing I will say about essential oils. Here's a fun list of essential oils that are specifically toxic to pets, specifically cats, but generally follows protocol for dogs too. Bergamot, cinnamon, clove, eucalyptus, pennyroyal, geranium, lavender, lemon, lime, and orange, anything citrusy. Lemongrass, rose, rosemary, sandalwood, tea tree, thyme, the mint family, and lang lang. Those ones are specifically dangerous to cats. The essential oils. Now, the smell of it is not necessarily the thing that makes it dangerous. It's like the volatile oil, like the volatile compounds and essential oils that makes them dangerous. If you have pets, tea tree oil is so deadly to pets. If you have pets, just don't even buy it. Don't even buy products with it in it. It is so dangerous for them. It is so, like, it will kill them very, 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 very quickly. There's unfortunately not much you can do once they have either ingested it or if it has gone in, if they've breathed it in. Have pets, just don't get tea tree oil. Just don't do it. It's not worth it.
Yeah. Okay. Now that you've heard us rant about lots of we have one final segment, and Felicity really I think. And again, in all capitals here, so we're yelling at you through the screen, yelling out of a desire to keep you safe. Don't put it in the ground and other environmental concerns. So Felicity, take it away.
Yes, I will go through this, and then you two, if you want to expand on why you shouldn't put it in the ground. So here are many things not to put in the ground or on the ground. If it has salt, do not put it in the ground. People love to salt the earth for some reason in witchcraft. If it has salt, I will say this again, if it has any salt, do not put it in the ground. If it is an invasive plant species with a possibility to grow, here in like northeastern America, I don't know why I forgot what country here in the Northeast, things like wormwood and mugwort will grow like nobody's business. If it is invasive plant species with a possibility to grow seeds, for example, do not put it in the ground. If it has alcohol, be mindful where you put it. You can pour alcohol on the ground. Just don't pour it in the same place too much. Like, do it in different
I'm going to
patches.
speak on that really quickly. So with the alcohol, ethanol and isopropanol specifically lead to stunted plant growth, and at high enough concentration, which would happen if you continuously poured it into the same place, can actually lead to plant death. So be very mindful of what you're putting in the ground. Preferably, don't put any methanol at all in the ground. Methanol can be very toxic to plants if you do it at high enough concentration. I did read that there was a study that said methanol can actually maybe help promote plant growth even, but I didn't look into that too much. But just like in general, if you can, don't put alcohol in the ground. It's really not good for it. At a high enough concentration, it can lead to plant death. So be very mindful of that.
You can always, if you do like wine, for example, like libating wine is quite common, I would say. You can always follow that up with water to decrease the concentration of alcohol there, just to kind of make it a little bit less risky.
So if it has wax, especially paraffin, do not put it in the ground. If it's food that might attract wild animals or it's shallow enough for a dog or a coyote that can dig it up, do not put it in the ground. I live in an area with lots of coyotes. If you are burying an offering, generally try not to bury meat, but if you're like really insistent on it, dig it 6 inches plus. Because the last thing you want is to attract coyotes or raccoons to where you are. If it's toxic to wild animals who can get to it, because they will, do not put it in the ground. If it is not biodegradable, I'm looking at jar spells here. Do not put it in the ground. Do not put jars in the ground.
Yeah, a word of note with that. If you intend on burying something, consider doing it with biodegradable items. So a friend of mine in my Discord server once suggested using avocado peels, which I think is brilliant because those are biodegradable and they come in those like little boats. And so they would hold whatever you were intending to bury. Yeah, jar spells, listen, don't put your jars in the ground, okay? Don't do it. It's bad for the environment. A lot of times they're going to get dug up if you don't bury them deep enough. Glass does not decompose. Okay, so don't put it in the ground. You are disrupting an ecosystem by adding something that won't decompose over time.
Yeah, so I think I've reached the end of do not put it in the ground. If you guys want to expand on any of those points.
Also, don't disrupt the ground. That's another thing. It's really common for people who are out in nature to like make cairns and things like that. So like picking up rocks and stacking them up, and it's a common thing for people to do when they're out hiking, or even as part of like a witchcraft practice. But that's really, really bad for local environments. There are insects that live under there. Hellbender salamander in Appalachia is apparently also very endangered because people keep disrupting its habitat. So not only should you not be burying things that are not biodegradable, but just leave the land in as close as a state as you found it. I think that is generally good advice.
Okay, so we've been recording for a long time, so we'll wrap it up here with some final kind of tips related to risk assessment. There's a couple questions that you should ask yourself as we go along. We can like rotate through these if you guys want. And the first one is ask yourself if you have to do it. So if you don't need to do something that could potentially be hazardous, don't do it. You don't ever need to feel pressured. And if there's a safer alternative, please choose that route. Your safety and also the safety of the environment is of paramount importance. It's much more important than, quite frankly, the spell that you're doing. It's not going to help you if you're dead. So just ask yourself if you have to do it. And if there's a safer alternative, please choose a safer alternative. Substituting things into like spell work that maybe are more like safer for you, but maybe aren't like let me just, for instance, if you're going to make flying ointment, let's say that you want to include maybe some herbs that aren't as toxic to be safer about it. That's not going to decrease the like magical properties of your ointment. Like it's still going to be a flying ointment. You've just been safer about it. Like that, those are the kind of things that we're talking about. Replacing something with a safer alternative doesn't decrease the magical like usage or the intensity of which it might like have. So just keep that in mind.
The next thing is sorry. So the next thing is if you have to do it, then can you somehow do less of it? So this is just remembering that your risk is always the hazard of the activity you're doing times the exposure. So how can you minimize your exposure to it? So in Felicity's example, that might be aliquoting a really small amount of her pennyroyal essential oil out, so she didn't spill a whole lot onto her arms. That might be scaling down the size of a candle or the amount of incense you burn. It might be diluting an essential oil, but basically just minimizing the amount that you're using so that you are exposed to less hazard.
And if you have to do it, what systems can we use to lower the risk? For example, using sand or salt to extinguish fire, and ventilation. If you can have your windows open, or even better, if you can go outside. That just even having the ventilation, our lungs are so sensitive, especially right now. We want to take good care of them.
And the final question is, how can you continue to improve it? Safety is ever evolving. It is not a static, once and done type of thing. You should constantly be evaluating the safety of your practice and the things that you're doing. And if something is no longer safe, reevaluate ways to then make it safe. Always be looking at what you're doing and making sure that the way in which you're performing certain spells or rituals are being done safely, both for you, the environment, and any like pets or children that you might have around. It's the constant evaluation, something to always be aware of. But I think that wraps up this episode. Thank you so much for listening. It is going to be a long one, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen through. And yeah, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next week.